Clara woke up to the soft, gray light of early morning, filtering through the thin curtains of her tiny apartment. The room smelled faintly of yesterday's leftovers, a reminder of the small, constant battle she fought to make ends meet. She stretched her arms, trying to shake off the lingering weariness in her muscles. Life had been hard for her ever since she lost her mother a few years ago. Her mother had been a pianist, not famous, not wealthy, but her music had filled their small home with warmth, comfort, and hope. Clara had loved sitting in the corner of their living room, listening to her mother's hands dance across the piano keys, imagining herself in a world far beyond the one she lived in. Since her mother passed, Clara had tried to hold on to the music in her heart, but life never let her fully escape. She had to work long hours in restaurants and small shops just to pay the rent and buy a few basic groceries. She learned early that the world could be cold, and kindness rare. Still, she carried her love for music like a secret treasure, playing quietly in the corners of her mind, sometimes on an old, battered keyboard she had managed to keep from the days when her mother had been alive. That morning, like every other, Clara dressed quickly in her uniform, a simple black dress with a white apron, and stepped out into the narrow streets of the city. The air smelled of smoke and wet concrete. Vendors called out in the distance, selling bread, eggs, and fruit. Clara hugged her bag close to her chest, hoping it held enough for a small breakfast. Most days, it didn't. She had learned to ignore the hunger pangs that gnawed at her stomach, focusing instead on the work ahead. Her shift at the restaurant started early. The establishment was one of the most luxurious in the city, known for its expensive meals and its clientele of wealthy patrons. Clara had learned to move quietly, carrying trays without spilling a drop, smiling politely even when she felt invisible. The rich guests hardly noticed her, treating her as if she were part of the furniture. Some would barely acknowledge her presence, tossing orders across the table as if she were just a ghost in their world of fine dining. Despite the coldness of her job, Clara didn't complain. She had pride in her work and doing something well, no matter how small. Yet inside, there was always a longing for something more, a life that included music, beauty, and freedom. She thought often about the piano her mother had played, and the feeling of the keys under her own fingers. Sometimes, when the restaurant was empty, she would hum quietly, letting the notes of imaginary melodies float around her. It was a small rebellion against the harshness of her world. That evening, Clara found herself serving a group of particularly wealthy guests. They were celebrating something, though she couldn't quite make out what. The table was covered in the finest dishes, gleaming cutlery and crystal glasses that reflected the chandelier light like tiny stars. Clara moved among them silently, taking orders, pouring drinks, and carrying plates. She felt a familiar mix of invisibility and discomfort, knowing that any mistake could earn her a sharp word or a stern look. As she placed a plate of roasted chicken in front of one guest, she overheard their conversation. The guests were talking loudly, laughing, and showing off their wealth. "I can't believe the price of this meal," one of them said with a smirk. "At this rate, you should probably play an instrument just to earn a bite of food." Everyone at the table laughed, the sound sharp and hollow, echoing off the walls. Clara froze for a moment, her heart sinking a little. She knew they didn't mean her. They were talking about some imagined far-off world where music could be bartered for sustenance. But something inside her stirred. She had spent her whole life feeling small, unseen, and powerless. And now, with a quiet courage, she said softly, "Can I play for a piece of food?" The table erupted in laughter. Clara felt her cheeks burn, wishing she could disappear. The idea of a waitress offering to play music for a meal was to them ridiculous. They leaned back in their chairs, whispering jokes to one another, shaking their heads. Clara tried to smile politely, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the tray. Even as they laughed, she didn't feel anger. She felt a strange mixture of sadness and determination. Music was her life, her escape, and her voice. The laughter of these strangers could not take that away from her. She had to try, even if it meant risking ridicule. One guest, a man who had not spoken much, observed her quietly from across the table. He was older, with a calm presence that set him apart from the others. He didn't laugh. Instead, he watched Clara with a curious expression, as if he sensed something hidden beneath her humble appearance. He leaned over to the manager and spoke quietly, something Clara couldn't hear. The manager approached her cautiously, asking if she truly wanted to play. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Could it really be possible? She nodded, barely trusting her own voice. The manager gestured toward a lounge area where a piano stood, polished and gleaming in the dim light. Clara followed, each step heavy with nerves and anticipation. As she entered the lounge, the sight of the piano took her breath away. It was beautiful, the kind of piano she had only ever dreamed of playing. Her fingers itched to touch the keys, to feel the cool, smooth surface beneath her hands. For a moment, she hesitated, questioning if she was brave enough. She had not performed in front of people for years. And these were not ordinary people. They were rich, discerning, and likely expecting little from her. But then she thought of her mother, and the countless hours they had spent together in the small, cramped living room of their apartment. She remembered the joy, the freedom, and the sense of belonging music had given her. Clara took a deep breath, sat down, and placed her hands on the keys. At first, the notes were timid, uncertain. Her fingers shook, and the sound seemed fragile in the large, silent room. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memory of her mother guide her. Slowly, her confidence grew. Her hands moved with precision and grace, each note flowing into the next like water. A melody began to take shape, full of emotion, passion, and beauty. Back at the table, the guests had stopped talking. They leaned forward, curious, their laughter replaced by the quiet intrigue of disbelief. Clara's music filled the room, carrying with it a story of struggle, hope, and hidden talent. It was as if the piano had become an extension of her soul, speaking the words she had never been able to say aloud. In that moment, Clara felt a freedom she had never known. The room, the wealthy patrons, the judgment, they all faded away. There was only the music, only the connection between her and the piano. She played with everything she had, every ounce of emotion pouring through her fingers. She was no longer just a waitress, no longer just a girl struggling to survive. She was an artist, a master of her craft, and the world could not deny it. When the last note lingered in the air, there was a pause. A silence so deep it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. The guests, who had laughed moments ago, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Clara opened her eyes, meeting their gazes with quiet strength. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not for her uniform, not for her struggle, but for who she truly was. Clara stood, her hands still hovering over the keys. The applause started slowly, hesitant at first, then grew louder. Some guests clapped politely, unsure how to react. Others stared, mouths slightly open as if they were struggling to reconcile the image of the timid waitress with the piano master who had just played before them. In that moment, Clara realized something important. She didn't need wealth, fame, or approval to define her worth. Her music, her talent, and her courage were enough. The laughter of strangers could not diminish what she carried within her. And even if no one ever paid her for her music, even if she only played for a piece of bread, she would continue. Because music was not just a skill, it was her voice, her freedom, and her life. The older gentleman who had observed her silently approached after the applause faded. He smiled, a quiet, genuine smile, and nodded in acknowledgement. Clara felt a spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something new. As she returned to her duties that night, Clara carried herself differently. There was a lightness in her step, a confidence in her heart. She had faced the laughter, stepped into the unknown, and emerged unshaken. The piano, the music, and the memory of her mother had given her a gift that no hardship could take away. And in that moment, Clara understood that sometimes, all it takes is one brave act to change everything. After Clara's quiet request to play for a piece of food, the laughter at the table seemed to grow louder, sharper. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks as the wealthy guests leaned back in their chairs, exchanging amused glances. Some whispered jokes to one another, mocking the idea of a waitress thinking she could ever perform for them. Clara's heart sank for a moment. She had expected disbelief, maybe even dismissive comments, but not the outright amusement that made her feel small, almost invisible. For a moment, she considered walking away, pretending she had said nothing. After all, what could she, a simple waitress struggling to get by, possibly offer to these people? They lived in a world of wealth, indulgence, and grandeur. Her music seemed meaningless against that backdrop, but as she looked down at her hands, slightly trembling, she remembered the lessons from her mother. Music was more than just sound. It was courage, it was expression, it was life itself, and she would not let fear steal that from her. Still, Clara felt the weight of embarrassment. She quietly carried the empty tray back to the kitchen, trying to gather her thoughts. In the back, away from the laughter, she took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs slowly and deliberately. She reminded herself that this was not about their approval. It was about her own voice. Her hands itched for the piano, and she knew deep down that this was the moment she had been waiting for, even if she hadn't realized it yet. Meanwhile, at the table, the guests continued their mocking laughter, unaware that one among them had noticed Clara's quiet determination. He was an older gentleman, calm and observant, his eyes fixed on her with a curiosity that set him apart from the rest. He did not join in the ridicule. Instead, he leaned toward the manager, speaking softly, almost as if sharing a secret. The manager nodded, looked at Clara for a brief moment, and then approached her. "Would you like to play?" he asked cautiously, his tone almost apologetic. "We have a piano in the lounge." Clara blinked. Her stomach twisted with nervous anticipation. Could this really be happening? Was someone actually giving her the chance to play? Despite the ridicule she had just faced, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I'd like that." The manager guided her through a quiet hallway, away from the noisy dining area. The walls were adorned with expensive artwork, gold-trimmed frames that caught the dim light in a way that seemed almost mocking. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she followed him to a small lounge at the end of the corridor. There in the center of the room sat a grand piano polished to a gleaming shine. The keys looked inviting and intimidating all at once. Clara approached it slowly, her fingers hovering over the surface as though afraid to touch it. She closed her eyes for a moment, recalling her mother's gentle hands guiding her over the keys. The memory was comforting, a lifeline in the storm of nerves swirling inside her. She remembered the way her mother had smiled as Clara learned new melodies, the way music had filled their small apartment with warmth, and the pride she had felt even as a child. With a steadying breath, Clara lowered her hands to the keys. At first, her fingers trembled slightly as they pressed the notes. The sound was delicate, uncertain, almost fragile. But as she continued, a strange calm settled over her. She remembered the countless hours she had spent playing alone, teaching herself new pieces from worn-out sheet music. Slowly, the notes became confident, fluid, and expressive. A melody emerged, carrying with it the emotions she had long buried: longing, hope, sorrow, and joy. Back at the dining table, the laughter of the wealthy guests faded as curiosity took hold. Some turned toward the lounge, glancing through the open door to see what Clara was doing. Their amusement was replaced by a quiet, almost incredulous attention. A few guests whispered among themselves, unsure of what to make of this sudden change. The older gentleman who had noticed Clara earlier remained silent, his eyes focused on her like a teacher watching a student, waiting for something remarkable to happen. As Clara continued to play, her confidence grew. Her hands moved with precision, her fingers dancing across the keys as though they had never forgotten the rhythms ingrained in her from childhood. The music swelled, filling the lounge with emotion that seemed almost tangible. It was no longer just a song. It was a story, a declaration of resilience, a quiet triumph over the hardships that had shaped her life. The guests, now fully attentive, began to feel the impact of her talent. The rich man who had whispered to the manager leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. The others too stopped their chatter, their expressions shifting from amusement to disbelief. The simple waitress who had been laughed at moments before was now commanding their attention, her music speaking a language they could not ignore. Clara felt herself becoming lost in the music, her nerves replaced by a sense of purpose. Every note was a piece of her story. The hunger she had endured, the long hours of work, the loneliness she had known, and the dreams she had never let go. She played not for their approval, not for applause, but because it was the only way to express the depth of her heart. The piano became an extension of herself, each key resonating with the life she had lived and the hope she carried forward. The guests, once dismissive and mocking, now sat in stunned silence. Some had tears in their eyes, moved by the raw, undeniable talent before them. Others whispered to each other, unable to reconcile the image of the shy, quiet waitress with the pianist who was now commanding the room with such skill. The older gentleman simply smiled, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes, recognizing what Clara had always known, that talent cannot be measured by appearance or circumstance. Clara's performance continued, each note carefully chosen, each chord filled with emotion. She felt a strange sense of liberation, as though the music itself was lifting the weight of her struggles from her shoulders. She was no longer just a waitress in a restaurant. She was an artist, a storyteller, a force to be reckoned with. The piano had become her voice, louder and more powerful than she had ever imagined it could be. As the final notes lingered in the air, the room fell into a profound silence. Clara slowly lifted her hands from the keys, her heart still racing, her breath slightly uneven. She opened her eyes and looked around, meeting the astonished gazes of the guests. The laughter and mocking expressions had vanished, replaced by awe and, in some cases, guilt. The man who had first noticed her talent nodded in approval, his eyes twinkling with quiet respect. The first clap came from him, slow and deliberate. Then another guest hesitantly joined in, and soon the entire table was applauding. Some clapped politely, while others clapped with genuine amazement. Clara felt a rush of emotions, relief, pride, and a quiet triumph that warmed her heart. She realized that in that moment she had shown the world, or at least this small corner of it, who she truly was. Yet despite the applause and attention, Clara remained humble. She knew that the room's reaction was not the goal of her music. What mattered most was that she had stood up, faced their laughter, and allowed herself to be seen. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of belonging, not because of money, beauty, or social status, but because of her own courage and talent. After the performance, the older gentleman approached her. He offered a warm smile and a few kind words praising her skill and composure. Clara thanked him quietly, feeling a spark of hope ignite within her. Perhaps there were opportunities ahead, moments where her talent could be recognized and appreciated. But even if there were not, she had already won something far greater. The knowledge that she could stand tall, that her music had the power to move people, and that she was not defined by her circumstances. Returning to her duties that night, Clara walked with a quiet confidence. The restaurant no longer felt like a place where she was invisible. She had made herself seen not with words but with her music. The patrons she had once feared or ignored now regarded her with a new awareness. Some still whispered among themselves, but the laughter that had earlier cut through her like a knife was gone. Clara carried the memory of that performance with her as she worked, feeling lighter and more alive than she had in years. She had faced doubt, ridicule, and fear, and she had risen above it. Her music had not only entertained, but had transformed the way those around her perceived her. And more importantly, it had reminded her of her own worth, her own voice, and her own unbreakable spirit. That night, as she cleaned tables and served the last orders, Clara felt a sense of calm and fulfillment. She knew that this was only the beginning of something greater, even if she could not yet see the path ahead. The music, her love, and her courage had opened a door to respect, recognition, and the promise of new possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, Clara allowed herself to dream a little bigger, to hope a little more, and to believe that her life could be more than survival. It could be a story worth telling. The soft echoes of Clara's final notes still lingered in the air when the room fell into an almost unnatural silence. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, timid clapping, unsure of how to respond to the unexpected display of talent. It was as though the room itself had to adjust, catching up with what had just happened. Clara stood there, hands still resting lightly on the piano keys, her heart racing with the adrenaline of the moment. The weight of the guests' gaze was palpable, but instead of shrinking under it, she felt a new strength growing within her. She slowly lifted her hands from the piano and turned to face the guests. Her cheeks flushed with a mix of nerves and pride. The first few seconds felt like an eternity, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. What if they laughed again? What if they didn't think she was good enough? She had stepped into the unknown, and there was no turning back now. But then slowly, one of the guests, an older woman dressed in a luxurious yet understated gown, began to clap. Her hands came together softly, and as if on cue, the others joined in. At first, it was a gentle applause, a quiet acknowledgement of what they had just witnessed. But the more Clara stood there, the more the room began to stir with energy. The clapping grew louder, more enthusiastic, until it became a full round of applause that filled the room with a warmth she hadn't expected. Clara felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also something deeper, pride maybe, or a sense of triumph. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She had shown them something they didn't expect, something they hadn't even thought to look for. The music had lifted her above the uniform, above the role they had tried to force her into. She had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long time. As the applause died down, Clara took a deep breath, her hands still resting at her sides. Her heart was still beating faster than normal, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She hadn't expected this kind of response, not after the laughter, not after the teasing. Yet here she was, standing in front of them, no longer just a waitress, but someone who had given them something real, something raw. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the power of the moment. A few guests exchanged looks among themselves, murmuring quietly. There was no mistaking the change in atmosphere. The earlier mocking had faded, replaced by something else. An appreciation, maybe even admiration. The older gentleman who had first noticed Clara sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He hadn't clapped with the others, but his eyes gleamed with a kind of quiet recognition. Clara couldn't read his thoughts, but she could feel that he was different from the rest. He wasn't simply impressed by her music. He seemed to understand something deeper, something that made his gaze linger just a little longer than the others. "That was incredible," one of the guests said finally, a man in a sharply tailored suit. His voice was genuine, lacking the edge of mockery that had marked his earlier comments. You really are something." Clara didn't know how to respond. She had never sought compliments, never longed for praise. Her whole life had been about getting by, surviving the day-to-day. To hear this kind of praise now from people who had once dismissed her was overwhelming in a way she couldn't fully process. She smiled softly, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the still echoing applause. But the man continued, his tone changing as he spoke. "I'm sorry. We were all a little dismissive earlier. I didn't realize you had such talent. You should be playing for much bigger audiences than this." Clara felt a strange knot in her stomach. Part of her wanted to thank him for his kindness, to accept his words at face value, but another part of her hesitated. She didn't want this moment to become something superficial, something reduced to empty praise. The music was real. It was a part of her soul, and she didn't want to hear it trivialized. "I don't play for an audience," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I play because I love music. That's enough for me." The guests, all of whom had been expectantly waiting for her to speak, fell silent. Clara's words hung in the air, and for a moment no one knew quite how to respond. The older man who had been watching her all along finally broke the silence with a soft chuckle. "You're right," he said, his voice rich with understanding. "It's never about the audience, is it? It's about the music." Clara nodded, her heart swelling just a little. For the first time in a long time, someone truly understood. He didn't see her as a waitress or someone to be pitied. He saw her for what she was, a talented musician who had chosen not to hide her gift, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. The guests, once so cold and dismissive, now asked her questions about her music, her background, and her passion. They seemed genuinely interested, no longer looking at her as a servant, but as someone with a unique and powerful story. For the first time, Clara felt like she was on equal footing with them. It wasn't about the food, the wealth, or the status they held. It was about music, a language they could all understand, no matter where they came from or what they had. One of the women at the table, a younger lady who had been sitting quietly throughout the performance, spoke up. "I have a friend who organizes charity events," she said. "You should come to one of her parties sometime. She's always looking for performers." Clara hesitated, unsure. She didn't like the idea of being put on display, of performing for people who might not appreciate her for who she truly was. She didn't want to be part of a world where people only cared about her music because of her ability to entertain. But there was something about the woman's offer, something genuine in her eyes that made Clara pause. "I'll think about it," Clara said, her voice steady. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a rejection either. She wasn't sure what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long time, she felt open to possibilities she had once shut out. The evening continued on, and Clara returned to her duties, moving among the guests with a newfound grace. She wasn't sure how she had ended up here, in this moment, surrounded by these people who had once laughed at her, but as she worked, she could feel their eyes on her, not as the servant, not as someone to be ignored, but as someone they had seen, truly seen, for the first time. The older gentleman approached her again before she left for the night. His eyes were warm and he smiled gently as he handed her a card. "If you ever need help getting your music out there," he said, "don't hesitate to reach out. You have a gift. Don't let it stay hidden." Clara took the card, her fingers brushing against his. She nodded, a small but genuine smile spreading across her face. "Thank you," she said quietly, tucking the card into her apron. As she stepped out into the cool night air after her shift, Clara felt different. She had been through so much, so many long hours of hard work, of feeling invisible, of struggling to make ends meet. But now, she was no longer the girl who worked in the background, unnoticed and unimportant. She was someone with a gift, someone worthy of attention. Not for her appearance, not for her status, but for the music she carried inside her. Clara didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. She felt like her story was still being written, and this was just the beginning. After that evening, Clara's life seemed to shift in ways she hadn't expected. The performance had not only caught the attention of the guests, but had begun to change the way people saw her, even outside the restaurant. The older gentleman's card rested in her apron pocket for days, a small, tangible symbol of possibility. She would often pull it out and study it, running her fingers over the embossed letters, imagining what it would be like to take that first step towards something more. At work, things had subtly changed. Some of the regular patrons who had witnessed her performance now treated her with a hint of respect they had never shown before. They asked her small questions about music, her background, or even her favorite composers. Clara answered politely, careful not to let pride overtake her humility. She was still the same waitress, still facing the same struggles, but she felt a spark of validation that she had long been denied. It wasn't about praise. It was about being recognized for who she truly was. Even the staff at the restaurant began noticing the change. Co-workers who had previously ignored her now smiled more often, offering small words of encouragement or gentle curiosity about her talents. It was strange for Clara, used to moving through the world unnoticed, to suddenly feel seen. Yet there was no arrogance in her. The music had given her confidence, not conceit. She had learned that recognition could be gentle, quiet, and still deeply meaningful. One afternoon, Clara decided to take the card from her apron and finally reach out. She nervously dialed the number, her fingers trembling slightly. The person on the other end spoke warmly, immediately putting her at ease. They arranged a meeting to discuss an opportunity for Clara to perform at a small private gathering, a chance to share her music with people who might genuinely appreciate it. The thought filled Clara with both excitement and fear. She had never imagined performing for strangers outside the quiet privacy of a piano in her apartment. Yet she knew this was an opportunity she could not ignore. In the days leading up to the event, Clara practiced tirelessly. She played for hours each night, sometimes late into the small hours of the morning, letting her fingers glide over the keys with precision and emotion. The melodies she created were more than music. They were stories, each note carrying the weight of her struggles, hopes, and dreams. Her apartment, though small and modest, transformed during these sessions into a sanctuary. The worn furniture faded into the background, replaced by the sound of flowing music that seemed to fill every corner of the room. The night of the performance arrived. Clara dressed in her simplest, neatest attire, wanting nothing to distract from her music. The gathering was in a small, elegant space, far different from the grandiosity of the restaurant, but it carried its own quiet sophistication. Guests chatted softly as she was introduced, their curiosity palpable. Some were wealthy, others were artists and musicians, but all shared a deep appreciation for talent and expression. As Clara took her place at the piano, a hush fell over the room. The nervousness that had plagued her for days melted away as she allowed the first notes to escape her fingertips. The melody was soft at first, tentative as she tested the acoustics and felt the energy of the audience. Then slowly it grew in strength and complexity, unfolding like a story that could be heard without words. Each note resonated, drawing the listeners in, capturing their attention with a force that was gentle yet undeniable. The audience was captivated. Clara noticed the subtle expressions on their faces, the raised eyebrows, the leaning forward, the soft nods of appreciation. People who had come to the gathering expecting small, polite entertainment were now completely absorbed. Some closed their eyes, letting the music take them away. Others watched her hands with amazement, seeing the skill, precision, and passion in every movement. Clara played not to impress but to share, and that sincerity created a connection that went beyond applause or recognition. By the time she finished the first piece, the room was silent for a heartbeat before breaking into genuine applause. This was different from the polite clapping she had received at the restaurant. This was heartfelt, acknowledging the depth of her talent and the emotion she had shared. She allowed herself a small, quiet smile, feeling a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with wealth, fame, or status. For the first time, she felt her music was being appreciated for its true value. Afterward, guests approached her one by one, offering kind words and sincere compliments. A few asked if she would consider performing regularly, and some even inquired about teaching or collaborating. Clara felt a mix of excitement and caution. She wanted to share her music, but she didn't want to feel pressured or lose the joy she found in it. She politely listened to each suggestion, keeping her heart open to possibilities while remaining grounded in her own purpose. The older gentleman, the one who had first recognized her talent, stayed until the end. He watched as Clara spoke with the guests, a quiet pride in his eyes. Finally, he approached her, his voice gentle but firm. "You have something rare," he said. "Many people have talent, but few have the courage and heart to share it. Don't let fear hold you back." "The world needs to hear your music," Clara nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. She wanted to speak, to express her gratitude, but words felt insufficient. Instead, she offered a humble smile, the kind that comes from deep understanding rather than performance. She realized that this encouragement was not about status or opportunity alone. It was about validation, the kind that comes from someone truly seeing your potential and believing in it. In the following weeks, Clara's life began to change, gradually but unmistakably. She started receiving small invitations to play at private events, community gatherings, and even charity functions. Each time, she approached it with the same quiet determination and focus she had brought to her performance at the restaurant. She never sought the spotlight, never demanded attention, but the more she played, the more people noticed. Word spread about the waitress with the piano, the woman whose music could captivate and move audiences of all kinds. Despite these opportunities, Clara remained grounded. She continued to work at the restaurant, not out of necessity alone, but because she valued the simplicity and stability it provided. She learned to balance her life between work and music, finding a rhythm that allowed her to grow without losing herself. The experiences at the restaurant, the performances, and the recognition began to reshape her confidence, giving her the courage to step into spaces she had never thought possible. One evening, after a small performance at a community event, Clara walked home under the soft glow of streetlights. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers and distant city traffic. She felt a profound sense of gratitude as she reflected on how far she had come. Not long ago, she had been a young woman struggling to survive, dismissed by those around her, unsure if her music had any meaning beyond her own enjoyment. Now she was recognized, appreciated, and beginning to see a future where her talent could flourish. Yet she remained humble. Clara knew that talent alone was not enough. It required persistence, patience, and heart. She continued to practice diligently, always seeking to improve, to express more deeply, and to connect more meaningfully with her audience. She understood that the journey was ongoing, that recognition and opportunity were gifts to be earned, nurtured, and respected. Through it all, Clara never forgot the lessons of her mother, whose hands had taught her the beauty and power of music. The memory of those lessons guided her, reminding her that her gift was not for show but for expression, connection, and joy. She played for herself as much as for anyone else, finding fulfillment in the simple act of creating sound that could touch hearts. In this part of her journey, Clara began to understand the real value of what had happened that night at the restaurant. It was not merely a performance that had won applause. It was a turning point that opened doors she hadn't even imagined existed. The laughter that once cut so deeply now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. She had faced doubt, fear, and judgment, and had emerged not only unscathed but strengthened. Her music became her voice in the world, a means to express what words could not. Each performance was more than entertainment. It was a connection, a shared experience that transcended social boundaries, wealth, and status. People listened not because she was a waitress, nor because she had impressed them, but because the music itself was powerful enough to demand attention, respect, and emotional engagement. Clara began to dream in ways she had never allowed herself to before. She imagined performing in larger venues, collaborating with other musicians, perhaps even composing original pieces that could reach a wider audience. But even as she dreamt, she remained mindful of the path that had brought her here. The small apartment, the hard work, the quiet nights spent practicing alone. She carried these experiences with her, knowing that they shaped not only her music but the person she was becoming. Through it all, Clara remained grounded in humility, gratitude, and a quiet determination. She had seen firsthand how easily people could judge based on appearances, and she knew the importance of staying true to herself. Her talent had opened doors, but her character, her heart, and her commitment to music were what would sustain her as she moved forward. As the weeks went by, Clara's life began to change in ways she had never imagined. What had started as a small, unexpected performance in a luxurious restaurant had snowballed into a series of opportunities she couldn't have foreseen. Invitations to play at private events, community gatherings, and even charity concerts became a regular part of her life. The applause was nice, but it was never the reason she played. What mattered most was that her music was being heard. Clara didn't see herself as a star. She wasn't looking for fame or fortune, but she realized that her music had a power of its own. People were listening, really listening, in a way that she had always hoped for but never truly believed would happen. Her music was no longer just a way to escape her struggles or a solitary activity. It had become a bridge between herself and the world. A way to connect, to share her emotions, to tell stories that couldn't be told with words. One afternoon, as Clara finished another shift at the restaurant, she noticed something different. A man who she had seen at the bar before approached her. He wasn't one of the wealthy patrons who usually graced the restaurant with their presence. In fact, he seemed out of place among the other diners. He was dressed casually, his face kind but worn, and there was an air of quiet dignity about him. He was the kind of person who didn't demand attention, but his presence had a certain weight to it. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm yet filled with purpose. "I couldn't help but hear you play the other night." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You were at the event?" He smiled. "Yes, and I have to say, your performance and it moved me. I don't know how to explain it, but your music, it's different." Clara felt a flush of warmth in her cheeks. It wasn't the first time someone had complimented her playing, but there was something about the way he spoke that made her pause. This wasn't just about the skill of her music, it was about something deeper, something he could see that others hadn't. "Thank you," Clara replied, unsure of how to respond. "I just play because I love it. Music has always been a part of me." The man nodded thoughtfully. "I can tell, and I think others need to hear it too." Clara tilted her head slightly, curious. "What do you mean?" "I'm a music producer," he said, almost casually, as if it were no big deal. "And I've been working with a lot of musicians, but there's something about your sound. It's raw, it's real. I'd love to help you share it with a wider audience." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had never considered this before. Sure, she had dreamed of sharing her music with the world, but it always seemed out of reach. She had been raised to believe that people like her, people who worked hard for a living, didn't get those kinds of opportunities. "I'm not sure what to say," she replied, still processing what he was offering. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that." The man smiled gently. "You don't have to make any decisions right now, just think about it. All I'm offering is a chance. You deserve it." For the next few days, Clara couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. She knew her. Music had always been a part of her, something she held close to her heart, but the idea of opening herself up to a wider audience felt terrifying. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she wasn't what people expected? But deep down, she knew that she couldn't ignore this opportunity. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and overcome too many obstacles to let fear hold her back now. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to dream about what could be possible. About a life where her music wasn't just confined to the four walls of her apartment or the occasional performance in a small venue. She met with the producer a week later. The meeting was simple, professional, but full of promise. They talked about her music, her influences, and her dreams. Clara was still hesitant, unsure if this was the right path for her. But the producer was patient, offering her a sense of calm that made her feel like she wasn't jumping into the unknown. "We can take this slow," he assured her. "There's no pressure. I just think you have something special and it deserves to be shared." After a long week of thinking, Clara agreed to move forward. She began working with the producer, recording a few tracks, experimenting with different styles and shaping her sound. The process wasn't easy. There were long hours spent perfecting her music, moments of self-doubt, and times when Clara wondered if she was truly cut out for this. But through it all, she kept pushing forward, drawing strength from the same passion that had always driven her. As the weeks passed, Clara's life began to transform. The recordings turned into actual songs, and soon, she had enough material for an album. The producer worked with her to help refine the sound, but it was Clara's music that shaped everything. Each track was a part of her story, a reflection of her journey from the girl in the restaurant to the artist who was finally sharing her voice with the world. Eventually, Clara's album was ready. It was a modest release, not a grand debut, but it was hers. The music was raw and beautiful, filled with emotion and honesty. She released it online, unsure of what to expect, but hopeful that it would connect with others in the same way it had connected with her. The response was overwhelming. People, who had never heard of her before, began sharing her music, praising the depth of her sound and the vulnerability in her songs. It wasn't long before Clara was being contacted by people from all over the world. Musicians, critics, even fans, who wanted to collaborate with her or simply express their admiration for what she had created. For Clara, the real reward wasn't the growing fan base or the recognition. It was the sense of fulfillment she felt each time she played. For the first time in her life, she was doing what she loved and sharing it with the world, not because she had to, but because it was what she was meant to do. As her music spread, Clara was invited to play in larger venues, to perform for audiences that stretched far beyond her small apartment. She played not for fame or fortune, but because the music had a way of connecting people, of bringing them together in a way nothing else could. But even as her life changed, Clara remained grounded. She never forgot where she had come from, the restaurant, the long hours, the loneliness that had once defined her. Every note she played, every song she wrote, was a tribute to the journey that had brought her here. One evening, after a successful performance in a city far from home, Clara stood backstage, reflecting on how much had changed. She had once wondered if she would ever be able to share her music with the world. Now, it was happening, and it was all because she had taken that first step, the one that had terrified her the most. As she packed her things to leave, the older gentleman who had first recognized her talent came to find her. He smiled, as he always did, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "I knew you had it in you." Clara smiled back, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. She had done it, not just for the people who had believed in her, but for herself. She had taken the leap, stepped out of the shadows, and found her voice. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." The man nodded. "You did the hard part. Now just keep playing." And with that, Clara knew that no matter where her journey took her next, she would always have her music, her true voice, and it would continue to carry her forward, one note at a time.